Well, we have been moving at breakneck speed in terms of balance tuning in the PTR as we approach to season 3. From the 3rd of July to the 18th of July, in 15 days we have gotten four different sets of balance tuning in the PTR. So let's start with, I guess, the one left, the last one. Remember when we talked about the best performing specs in the PTR and we were mentioning who was getting nerfed? We mentioned that Beast Mastery had been nerfed, Balance had been nerfed, Marksmanship had been nerfed, Fire Mage had been nerfed. The last two ones that survived the set of nerfs were Shadow and Frost. So this puts an end to the reign of Frost Decay because they've gotten nerfed by 12%. The duration of Breath of Sindragosa has been reduced by roughly 20%, with Breath of Sindragosa doing 20% more damage. Now this is, well, there isn't much to say. It's not really like a mechanical nerfs to their playstyle, it's just a flat out 12% nerf based on the performance that they had been having consistently in the PTR after they were buffed. This is of course about 10 days after having all of their damage buffed by 10% and obliterate damage being buffed by 30%. This is still a stronger buff than this is a nerf. So overall, you will end up stronger than you were even after this nerf, even prior to the buff you had. You're still slightly stronger overall, just not nearly as powerful as you have been in the testing, and still overall should still be ahead of your counterpart, Unholy DK. Now this has been put into words, but it was already a thing in the PTR itself, the nerfs to the Keeper of the Grove Balance Druid. Now your 4-piece stores 3% of the damage instead of 5%, and its max storage has been reduced by 50%, and it was based previously on your max HP, now it's based on your spell power, and now the buff of the Dryad persists for 15 seconds instead of 45 seconds. Now the logic of all of this, as you see here, if you're not used to this, you see these bursts and you see that the damage average of Star Surge is, 14 million. The reality is that the average isn't 14 million. The reality is that outside of those big windows, the average of your Star Surge is like 2-3 million, and then inside of these windows you have 140 mil, 150 mil, 150, 120, 120, 120, 267 million Star Surge hits. Now you're wondering, hold on a second, Star Surge is your single target spender, you're fighting a pure single target boss. How come you go 40 seconds without clicking Star Surge? Well, the logic behind this is the fact that this Dryad buff, when you use CA, you summon the Dryad for 10 seconds. Once the Dryad expires, your next 2 Star Surges will damage for an additional amount equal to pre-nerf 5% of your damage done, with the cap being half of your max HP. So the logic here is, because this buff lasts for 45 seconds, I can get into CA on pull, don't use my 2 empowered Star Surges, wait for 40 seconds for me to use CA again, and use those mega empowered Star Surges in that window. Because in that window I have summoned a new Dryad, which means I am now storing the damage. So now the empowered Star Surges will be going in to store the damage, and once this CA window is over, I stop, I wait some 40 seconds again, and I use CA again, and now I get to use these further mega empowered Star Surges in this window, which then, when the window ends, I will have 2 more mega empowered Star Surges. The result is this, right? The result is that as soon as you enter your CA, you can land these empowered Star Surges from the previous CA, and then when this CA ends, you can land the empowered Star Surges right here. This resulted in Druid saying, you know what? I am doing so much damage in this window that outside of this window, like right here, I don't mind basically not even using my Star Surge. Because, if my Star Surge isn't empowered, I am doing like 2 million on average. But when it's empowered, I'm doing 120 million. So I'm perfectly okay not clicking Star Surge on single target and only clicking this into these windows, which was a completely degenerate playstyle, which is getting fixed by this major nerf for balance. What is perhaps surprising is that there is no sort of, compensation kind of fix for balanced druid. Now with this nerf, they are back to being quite average with this tier set. Talking about not being average is Flameshaper Evoker. It was one of the few healers we mentioned was in line for a nerf, and they get one. Essence Bomb healing has been reduced to 250% spell power instead of 500% spell power, so cut in half. Now, this cut in halfness doesn't have nearly as much power for two reasons. Reason number one, this had was so powerful that had a very, very high overhealing. If you look at here, you follow the line, 79% overhealing. This is very powerful, of course. It means that you basically didn't need 80% of this a lot of the time. It just went into overhealing. The other part is that while you were trying to make this work, as Blizzard says, they messed up. While they were trying to make Consume Flame work with its own buff created by the tier set, they broke the other passives of Evoker. Very simply, the TLDR is that normally as an Evoker you want to use the max value of your Tempo Charge and of your Call of Ysera to gain 60% more value of your Dream Breath, because Consume heals based on how powerful your Dream Breath is. So the more powerful it is, the more healing Engulf will do. So normally you would get a 60% stronger Dream Breath for your Engulf to use Consume Flame of that powerful Dream Breath. But because of this change, now your tier set buff, Inner Flame, would happen as you would click Engulf. The buff would immediately spawn and give you 25% more healing to your heal over time, which would work with the Dream Breath Engulf was being casted on. This, however, broke the other two passives you already had, the 60% total healing increase on Dream Breath. So you were making now the tier set work on your first Engulf and on your second Engulf, giving you 25% more healing on the first Engulf and 50% more healing on the second Engulf, but it was making your previous buffs, Call of Ysera and Tempo Charge, no longer work. So this basically TLDR results in Engulf being buffed again by like 20% more healing after SS Bomb is being nerfed, and still definitely not large enough nerfs basically to make Flameshaper Evoker being bad right now. The other one is a good buff, but it's for the Mythic Plus, and Preservation is not really gonna be meta in Mythic Plus. Temporal Anomaly now has a massively higher absorption shield in basically Mythic Plus. On 5 targets, it's gonna be like a 1.2 million absorb shield on your party, which is okay, but it's still not very great for you. What is not very great for you for hunters is another round of nerfs, 3% for BM and 10% for marksmanship. This is now the basically third nerf in a row for marksmanship. Already to their Dark Ranger, last time they were nerfed by like 8% in single target and 15% in AoE. Now they get a further flat 10% nerf. And then BM only 3%. Perhaps the more surprising one, maybe if you were thinking about the nerfs, it would have been 10% to BM and 3% to marksmanship, but instead it's marksmanship to get further nerfs. Talking about nerfs, Mage gets a split. Their base damage is buffed, Arcane 3%, Fire 3% plus your 2 finishers, this is like a 7% total, and then 10% to Frost. However, the counter to this is large nerfs to your tier sets, in particular this and this. Basically, Spellslinger is now deserted. Both Frost Mage and Arcane Mage are going to flee to Sun Fury, and Frostfire Fire has now also been giga nerfed, so Fire will also flee to Sun Fury as a result, and Frost Mage instead will flee back to Frostfire. Why? Well, we already mentioned what was the problem with this tier set, this Frostfire tier set for Fire. The sheer amount of value you were getting out of these two buttons as a Fire Mage. Remember when we made the example that Pyro is 1 million damage, Comet Storm is 20 million, so one Comet Storm is worth 20 Pyroblasts, except Comet Storm applies 150% effectiveness of Ignite instead of the 100% effectiveness of Ignite of Pyro. So Comet Storm was technically worth 30 Pyroblasts worth of Ignite. So this 150% effectiveness of Ignite was already nerfed like 3 days ago. It was nerfed down to 100%. Now it's been nerfed down to 50%. On top of this, Frostfire Bolt damage is down 5% in damage, Comet Storm is down another 10% in damage, and Glacial Spike is down 40% in damage. So this is down some 3% in damage, this is down over 1% in damage, and the effectiveness of Ignite of this one has been cut by 100%. It went from 150% effectiveness to 50% effectiveness. So while before, just a few days ago, this was worth 30 Pyros worth of Ignite, now it's worth 10 Pyros worth of Ignite. This is a massive nerf, which makes Frostfire Mage basically no longer viable. The other major nerfs, which makes Arcane also flee away from Spellslinger, is also kind of a bad one, because it doesn't just nerf your damage, it nerfs your playstyle, which is always one of the more delicate things to go and touch. Arcane Blast now grants only 1 Arcane Harmony stack instead of 2, and more importantly, your splinters no longer give you guaranteed Arcane Harmony procs, but instead only 1 in 4 now. So this is bad because the entire playstyle of Arcane was made much more fluid, much more smooth, because as you were playing Arcane, you were able to rush towards a pretty fast set of procs of max stacks thanks to your 4-piece. Upon reaching max stacks of Arcane Harmony, you get a free proc of Intuition, which is 50% more damage to your next Arcane Barrage and giving you free Arcane Charges. This was very good overall, because if you look at, for example, the buffs on this fight on the PTR after these buffs went live, after the changes were live, the buffs, but not the nerfs yet, you can see that Intuition here is proccing 92 times. So 92 times in 480 almost seconds. That's like a 1 Intuition proc every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds you get a free 50% damage increase Arcane Barrage that also gives you 4 Arcane Charges. You can see that in the results here, 92 procs of free empowered Arcane Barrages for 103 total casts. So 90% of all of your Arcane Barrages were all empowered by Intuition. Were all empowered by doing 50% more damage, which is a pretty large buff when Arcane Barrage is nearly 40% of your damage, right? So now this gets the amount of times you get to have these freebie empowered Arcane Barrages by a lot. And no, being buffed by 3% and having your Arcane Splinters buffed by 30% doesn't make up for it. So that's also killing Spellslinger Arcane, just like it's killing Frostfire Fire Mage, as well as Spellslinger Frost Mage, which gets the same treatment. Ice Lance only gives you your stack of Cold Front 50% of the time instead of 100, and the chance of Splinters to give you Cold Front is now 15 instead of 20. So it's just fewer amount of procs in the case of Frost Mage for Cold Front, which is still much less important and relevant than the Arcane Harmony for Arcane Mage. Sun Fury gets nerfed still, but it's not as big. Arcane loses 5% haste. Fire gets nerfed more, but Fire Sun Fury was also the more problematic one, which gets nerfed again. You used to get 25% haste after your combustion ended, now you gain 12. You used to gain a 1 second extension of your hyperthermia after combustion ends. It was nerfed to 0.5 seconds extension, and now it's nerfed to 0.25 second extension. So you have lost like 4 seconds of extension overall. And why not, the spell damage bonus after you exit combustion used to be 10%, then it was buffed to 20%, now it's nerfed again to 10%. And this overall for Fire should still be better than this, purely because of the size of these nerfs for Frostfire. That being said, these zero talents were overperforming. Blizzard was correct in saying that many Mage tier set bonuses were substantially overtuned, despite Mage generally average performance. So they tried to nerf the tier sets while buffing the overall power of the specs. Monk, the only one change to Monk, Mystic Touch now increases physical damage back to 5% instead of 8%. There were quite a few players, actually, surprisingly or not, who didn't understand why this was bad. You balance specs based on them having all of the raid buffs. So imagine, let's just make this extreme. Imagine if Mystic Touch buffed physical damage by 80%. This meant that all of the melee specs or all of the physical damage specs in the game would have had to be nerfed by 80%. To do the same balanced even damage they are doing now, if you gave Mystic Touch 80% more damage, you had to nerf all of the physical damage dealers by like 75%. Which means that when you don't have a Monk, those physical damage specs do less damage than a Hunter pet, because all of their damage had to be put into Mystic Touch, right? So, of course, this is not an 80% damage buff, it's only an 8% damage buff, but it still follows the same logic. If you buff Mystic Touch, you need to then nerf or balance physical damage dealers based on them having this 8% damage buff, which will then in turn, for example, make them weaker in Mythic Plus if you don't have a Monk in your group, for example. Sad noises, because we go through Paladin and we don't read Holy. Holy is gone. We only have minor changes to Ret. You know, all of these buffs combined are like a 4-ish% damage increase. You get Final Verdict, Imperial Hammer, you get your initial hit of Blade of Justice, your Judgment, your Hyler Judgment, your Crusading Strikes, all getting buffed by a tiny amount compared, of course, to the damage they are doing, because buffing Judgment by 30% or buffing Crusading Strikes by 30% might sound big, except then you look at the damage they do and 30% of this is 1% and 30% of this is also 1%. So it's not too huge, but Red Paladin was one of the worst performers in the PTR. After their Divine Hammer nerf of a while ago, Red Paladin showed up in the PTR doing, quite poorly. So this buff was actually quite warranted for Red Paladin. Who was also warranted was the nerf to Shadow Priest. Let's ignore this for Discipline. You are playing Oracle anyways, so this is just whatever. Shadow Priest, though, was the last one of the gang at the top we mentioned was in need or was likely going to get nerfs. We have gotten this nerfed, this nerfed, this nerfed, this nerfed, now this nerfed as well. This was the last survivor. Shadow Priest does get nerfed, and by quite a bit. It's not like the slap on the wrist you thought you got away with before. Because 15 days ago, in the first one of these quick rounds of tuning, Priest was hit with a 15% damage nerf to Void Volley and a 30% damage nerf to Idol of N'Zoth. So Priests were like bumping each other on the elbow, pretending like, yeah, this is, it's okay, it's acceptable. In reality, it was like a 2-3% damage nerf for a spec that was performing likely way better than it should have. And now, first of all, your Void Blast damage has been cut by 10%, which, if you look at the damage of Void Blast, is basically by itself is like a 2.6% nerf just by nerfing that. More importantly, though, your 4-piece now increases Void Torrent's damage by up to 60% instead of 200%, as well as consecutive Void Blasts now increasing Entropic Rift's damage by an additional 10% per application instead of 20% per application. This means that now also this gets its damage reduced, but not nearly as much. What is damaged though by a bit more in terms of overall value is Void Torrent. We touched on the difference between live when Void Torrent was hitting for like a 6, 7, maybe 8 million channel, and then in the PTR with this 200% empower was doing 24 million damage. So now the damage increase will only be 60%. You're losing all these combined, you're losing like 12% damage in single target, as well as some nerf in AoE, since Void Torrent is still very good for AoE in Mythic Plus. But in terms of single target, this is now the sizable, chunky nerf you are receiving. So it makes the pair, or even not the pair, but the trio, with the 10% nerf to marksmanship, the 12% nerf to Frost Decay, now you have a 10-12% nerf to Shadow Priest as well. Very heavy compared to the previous sets of changes. What is not heavy whatsoever are the changes to Rogue. So Rogue in the PTR has been in a pretty forgotten situation where they haven't gotten any attention to their talents, to their hero talents. Plenty of bugs are still existing. The only viable and valuable situation is when they can cleave off of more enemies, like some of these fights like Soul Hunters, for example, or even Soulbinder Araz with the adds spawning close to each other. But when it comes to, you know, pure single target like Fractilius, for example, they were not doing too well at all. So Assassination gets their AoE nerfed, and in return they get basically all of their buttons buffed. Outlaw gets 10% more single target damage, and Sub gets 11% more black powder, so AoE damage increased. Still definitely not what rogues would have wanted to see in their set of tuning for yet another season, yet another patch. This is still far too little, just like Shaman. This is far too little, not because this is too small of a nerf for enhancement. What we're complaining about now is Elemental. Elemental right now has got this tiny bit of a problem where overall they have been one of the consistently weakest specs in testing, and most of this had to do with their very weak single target damage. The problem right now with this Elemental is the fact that their damage with the new tier set, so the max level, or rather what you were testing, for example, on the PTR, was so weak that your current season 2 tier set is even, if not a slight 1% damage increase compared to the new tier set. You can see that, to no surprise, despite this one being PTR testing, for you to test the next season, you go into one of the better results, if you can call them better, because we're still talking about like middle of the pack kind of performance. This guy is playing with a 2-piece from the previous season, of course. And this is due to, very simply, lack of damage of this tier set. This is to the point where you are still looking for some kind of any buffs for Elemental as a build in general to make the tier set more valuable. In terms of Farseer, which is the one at the moment being quite underpowered, it does have to do also with your base spells, like for example having to buff the damage of your Lava Burst or the damage of your Spenders. You're still in a time where your finishers, your Spenders, do barely more damage than your Lava Burst, for example, or the fact that your tier set, while being very flavorful, doesn't actually add a lot of damage. Like Farseer gives you 25% faster cast time, but a lot of your casts are instant, so this is lost. Or increasing the recharge rate of Lava Burst by 50% for 8 seconds is like 1 extra Lava Burst per proc. You know, the 4-piece cannot be that weak. If it procced, it would have to be, you know, if it procced to make it feel super cool and to also make it seem as powerful as some of these other tier sets, this proc would have been 500% for 8 seconds, not 50%, right? So right now the numbers are just too small for Elemental, so we have to complain about this since they wouldn't even be able to use their new tier set in the next season. Warlocks are in a bad situation because the only playable Warlock right now is Demo. You can see it in the results already from the testing, where Demo was the only barely human looking one, unless you went into a council fight like Soul Hunters. Demo again with the 2 far behind. Soulbinder, you have Demo and the 2s are here. Lumitar, you have Demo here and the 2s are here. This has been consistent throughout the testing. Demo was the only one playing Soul Harvester that was doing any damage. So as a result, of course, Demo Soul Harvester doesn't actually get touched because he was doing fine already. What, however, gets giga buffed is Diabolist, literally doubling the damage of your 2-piece proc of your eyes that spawn, plus basically 50% more damage to all of your demons from your Diabolist hero talent. At the moment, this has actually even passed Soul Harvester, which you were already playing as Demo. even though technically Soul Harvester right now is bugged and you can't even play it in the PTR, even by simulations. Diabolist is just as powerful now as Soul Harvester for demo, which makes it even worse when you look at the Affliction and Destro situation, which is poor. You know, Hellcaller gets buffed for both by more or less the same amount, 15 and 30% more damage for Wither and Blackened Soul for Affliction, 10 and 20 for Destruction, simply because, due to how Destro works, Withered and Blackened Soul were doing more damage by default for Destro, and then making up for the lack of, I guess, Demon scaling mastery of Affliction. One of the reasons why Demo could do well playing Soul Harvester is because the mastery of Demo gives you pet damage. Soul Harvester has the Demonic Soul being coded as a demon, as your pet, which means that the dot over 9 seconds scales with your mastery, the damage in AoE around him scales with your mastery, the 4-piece of the Demonic Soul getting damage increase and Wicked Reaping damage increase, all scaled with Demon's mastery, but not with Affliction. So Affliction's one was terrible. So Blizzard now decided to give Affliction their own mastery, which is get helped by Blizzard and get bigger numbers in all of the abilities to make up for the fact that otherwise this would have been far too low for Affliction compared to Demo. The result though is still terrible for all of the Warlock specs not named Demo. There isn't much else to say actually for these specs. They are still viable and fine when it comes to spread, cleave, multi-target fights, like as mentioned the council fights. In Mythic Plus though, they will still need a whole bunch of single target damage to be viable compared to how Demo is right now. The rest of the changes are mostly relevant. 15% Bladestorm damage to both of the warriors and 10% Whirlwind damage to Fury. This has triggered warriors a bit because Blizzard is saying in the note, Fury has been struggling to keep up in sustained AoE combat. These changes are aimed at bolstering Fury. You know, maybe you could just increase their target cap from 5 to 8. I'm sure that would do wonders for their sustained AoE combat rather than giving them 10% whirlwind damage, right? So yeah, whatever, they are still shit in AoE regardless of these buffs. So all in all, after yet another round of tuning, we have gotten the, I guess technically one of the larger buffs was the Diabolist, particularly for Demo Warlock, as well as major nerfs going the way of some of these specs we already touched on for being powerful, so Blizzard correctly targeted them. So Shadow Priest, Marksmanship Hunter, Frost DK, and I guess as well Frostfire, Fire Mage, as well as Spellslinger Arcane have also been hit quite hard. In terms of healers, the only one that is being touched to a significant degree is Preservation Flame Shaper, whose nerf was big, but not as big as the tooltip of the nerf shows because of the bug fixes of their Dream Breath scaling now being better. And to finish, even though technically it was a nerf from the last patch already live, now it's just being made official, was the nerf to Balanced Druid, which was basically a bug, never was supposed to exist. So we can be happy about these changes for the very simple fact that at the very least we have the confirmation that Blizzard is tuning at a very fast pace. As mentioned, 4 sets of tuning in the past 2 weeks is a lot. Hopefully we will continue to have this many as we continue to get close to the release of Season 3. But for today, on this Friday, and according to some, the beginning of the weekend, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thanks again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, there's always the danger of using these kind of lights when it's summer with like 34 degrees outside. They are not helping.